From the Library of Congress in Washington, D.C.
Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Peggy Pearlstein, head of the Hebraic section here in the African and Middle Eastern Division of the Library of Congress. Welcome to today's program, a talk by Dr. Edward Goldberg about his new book, Jews and Magic in Medici Florence, The Secret World of Benedetto Blanes, co-sponsored with the European Division. Art historian Edward Goldberg received his PhD in modern history from Oxford University in 1979 and taught in the Department of Fine Arts at Harvard University from 1981 until 1987. A resident of Florence, Italy for the past 3 decades, Edward Goldberg founded the Medici Archive Project in 1995 to provide worldwide public access to historical data in the Medici Grand Ducal Archive through a fully searchable database at www.medici.org. The archive was established by Grand Duke Cosimo I in 1569 and contains 3 million letters in more than 6,000 volumes, offering the most complete record of any princely regime in Renaissance and Baroque Europe. I was privileged to visit the Medici Archive in 2002, where I spent a morning observing emerging scholars being trained in archival research and harnessing dynamic technological solutions for archive management. I was shown the working papers of the Grand Ducal Commission that instituted the first Florentine ghetto in 1570. I also saw the Jewish Identities database that is of importance to the scholarly world and to individuals engaged in family inquiries. As a result of that visit, I invited Edward to speak at the library in 2004 about the Medici Archive. I'm pleased that he's returned to talk about the research that culminated in his new book, which will be available for sale at the end of the presentation. And if we sell out of copies, please know that we have wonderful order forms here that Edward has brought himself. Next month, the Hebraic section will sponsor 2 programs. On May 12th, author Davy Walders will read poems she has written for a new book, Women Against Tyranny, Poems of Resistance During the Holocaust. And on May 17th, Sam Brolowski and Karen Lund will speak about gramophone and microphone inventor Emil Berliner and the Berliner Archive here at the library. This event is being videotaped for subsequent broadcast on the library's website and other media. The audience is encouraged to offer comments and raise questions during the formal question and answer period, but please be advised that your voice and image may be recorded and later broadcast as part of this event. By participating in the question and answer period, you are consenting to the library's possible reproduction and transmission of your remarks. And now, Dr. Edward Goldberg.
Thank you, Peggy. Gosh, was it really 2004 when I was here last? I mean, it feels like a whole other life. I mean, the year after, I bid fond farewell to Medici Archive Project and jumped back in the archive and did sort of research of my own. And I'll be talking about some of the rather remarkable, unsettling, frightening, rewarding things that I've been coming upon since. Thank you very much, Peggy, for that. Great. Can you hear me now? Okay, Ann, listen, can I appoint you microphone monitor? If at any time you can't hear me, do not wait 1 second. Tell me immediately, okay? One of the most traumatic experiences of my life was about 2004, as a matter of fact, I gave this sort of very exhausting, full-dress talk. Can I shift this? No. Okay. Now I'm there? A glass of water's going to be going over in your computer real soon. I mean, I'm... Okay. For me, all stories begin in the archive, specifically the archive of the Medici Grand Dukes of Tuscany, where I've been working for over 30 years. As you see, there's strip lighting, industrial shelving, millions of documents, and incredible surprises every day. This was the most overwhelming surprise of all. Archivio Medici do Principato 5150, Medici Grand Ducal Archive 5150, containing 200 letters from Benedetto Blanes Ebreo to Don Giovanni De Medici. Benedetto Blanes Ebreo, as you see in the cutout, HEB.O, Benedetto Blanes the Jew. Let's take a few steps back. Actually, let's take many steps back to the autumn of 1974 when I first ventured into the Florentine archive. I was then an art history grad student, beginning research on Medici patronage and collecting. Madonnas and crucifixes, Roman statues and Greek vases, frescoes and fountains, and so on. As the years passed, however, I became more and more involved with the archive as an archive. I also became more and more intrigued with life behind the scenes at the Medici court. Never trust an archivist who won't admit to being an historical voyeur at heart. From the very beginning, Jews and Jewish matters were in my range of vision, but only peripherally. While leafing through great stacks of documents in search of artistic commissions, palaces and churches, antiquities and state gifts, every now and then a letter would fall out of the archive and hit me over the head. There were requests from Jews for special favors, commercial privileges, tax breaks, travel permits, pardons for real or alleged crimes, often with masses of fascinating background information. Then there were reports about Jews to and from various members of the Medici court, often amazingly detailed and revealing. But these were usually one-off items, single letters, not ongoing streams of correspondence. But then, one day, I encountered Benedetto Blanes Ebreo and his 200 letters. Here was a personal challenge staring me right in the face. The outside of a letter, they didn't use envelopes back then, dated 1620, 3 October, sideways in the lower right-hand corner. From Benedetto's younger brother Solomon. Benedetto was already locked away in the Florentine prison where he spent many years. And we have scribbles and sketches by a Medici secretary, presumably trying out a new pen, including the head of a bearded Jew. This is a haunting image by any account, too strange to be a direct portrait. We see an archetype emerging from the mists of history, and, I would venture, the Christian subconscious. Let's begin with the strangely menacing object in the middle, suspended over the Jew's head. It must have begun life as a heraldic lily, the symbol of Florence, in fact. Then, in the upper left corner, sideways, we have a chalice. Are we talking sacramental blood of Christ? And in the upper right, possibly a crown, more likely a jester's cap. All we need are some little bells dangling from the horns. As you see, I have become more than a little obsessed with this drawing. Sure, thank you very much. Are we there now? This is a work in progress. Are we there? Okay. We have almost no representations of Jews from these years. Okay.
I'm very sorry about that.
No, please, that's okay.
I think it needs to be a little bit
All right, you just have to speak in here if you can.
Okay.
lower. Try it.
Really stand closely.
Uh,
Okay. Try.
okay, thank you. And,
Let me give it a try.
okay, please give it a try.
If y'all can hear me, you can hear anybody. Can you hear me? No. I don't know if it was working before.
First, see if you can find Paul. That would be good. Okay? Okay, try and continue. Just try and speak directly in there.
Anne said that the microphone needs to be a little higher, a little lower, actually. The trouble is I need to be a little higher. I'm simply too damn short. This happened before, actually. Okay, I'll take it that we're good to go. You're Paul?
Yeah.
Hello.
Let me check the volume. Okay, don't get too close to it.
Okay,
And
and
lean-
don't get too far away. I may need you again, okay?
Don't lean against here.
Okay, thanks, Paul. Anyway, as I was saying, I've become Okay, as I was saying, we have almost no representations of Jews from these years, so we tend to fixate on the very few that we have. What does it mean to find 200 letters from a Jew in early 17th century Florence? Or 200 letters from anyone, anywhere, for that matter? It means that we can listen in on a running conversation, one person talking to another, discussing real things in real time, in their own words. Or at least in this case, one side of a running conversation. Benedetto's letters to Don Giovanni survive in the Medici Archive, but only one of Don Giovanni's replies, returned to sender while the Jew was incommunicado in an isolation cell in the Bargello prison. Up above, Illustrissimo et eccellentissimo Signore e Padrone Comandissimo, to my most illustrious and excellent Lord and most esteemed patron, and below Benedetto Blanus Ebreo, from Benedetto Blanus the Jew. Benedetto's most illustrious lord and patron was Don Giovanni De Medici, son of Cosimo I, Grand Duke of Tuscany. Illegitimate son, but still a Medici in point of fact. These are both the same man, both in armor, both realized at more or less the same time when he was in his early 30s. But they reveal two very different aspects of his personality. On the left, we have a polished courtier, exquisitely refined, wearing his armor almost as a whimsy of style. Arching eyebrows, pointed mustache, and upswept curls. On the right, we have a man of action, a professional soldier on the field of battle, with thinning hair evidently matted by his helmet, which he has just removed. Don Giovanni was both of these at once. And since he was a Medici, he left us a lot of portraits. What about Benedetto Blanes Ebreo? What did Jews look like anyway in 17th century Italy? Few could afford portraits, and those who could usually shunned graven images. On the left, we have a generic peddler from the Venetian ghetto in his obligatory red hat. In Florence, it probably would have been yellow, hawking a miserable basket of pots and pans. On the right, we have both an actual portrait and a perennial type. Maggino di Gabriello, a Jewish smooth operator, imparting trade secrets to admiring Christians. But Maggino and whomever, they were both Jews living by their wits, one at the high end and one at the low. Letters. We are talking about letters. Fiorenza il 1 gennaio 1616. Florence, the 1st of January, 1616. All letters are written in a specific place at a specific time, and also for a specific purpose. Sometimes they convey information. Sometimes they affect action. Sometimes, more often than not, let's just think about our own letters and our own emails. They merely remind someone that we still exist. Da poiché vostra eccellenza illustrissima partì di Venezia non ho mai ricevuto nova della sua salute. Since your most illustrious excellency left Venice, I have not received word of your health. Starò aspettando notizie delle sue grandezze. I will be awaiting news of your great deeds. Supplicando il grande, begging God the great, shifting suddenly from Italian to Hebrew with the unspoken and usually unwritten name of God. Don Giovanni did not inscribe the sheet on the right, but he might well have done. It is the work of another Florentine aristocrat of that time, another Christian enthusiast of the more or less Jewish occult, working his way through the alphanumerical values of the Tetragrammaton. Recreational Kabbalah, perhaps a bit more. Like Don Giovanni, this Christian gentleman had taken the trouble to learn some Hebrew. Fiorenza, Benedetto Blanes Ebreo. Benedetto signed off on his letters in Florence, but as a Jew, his Florence was not the same as everyone else's. The Florentine ghetto is an essential element in the Blanes story, almost a living, breathing character, I am tempted to say. Piazza della Repubblica, today, in the heart of downtown Florence. The Jewish ghetto was located in the lower right-hand corner of the big aerial photo. On the triumphal arch in back, an inscription tells us part of the story. L'antico centro della città da secolare squamore a vita nuova restituito, 1895. The ancient center of the city, from age-old squalor, restored to new life, 1895. The former Jewish ghetto was the worst of the age-old squalor that urban renewers wanted to set right. But 1895 was not the first project of that sort in that part of town, nor the first bombastic inscription to appear. Let's jump back 3 more centuries to 1571. Over the main gate to the then new ghetto, surmounted by the Medici arms, Cosimo De Medici, Grand Duke of Tuscany, and his son, the most serene Prince Francesco, motivated in all things by great piety, willed that the Jews be enclosed in this place, segregated from the Christians but not expelled, so that through good example they might come to bow their stubborn necks to Christ's light yoke. Year of the Lord, 1571. Motivated in all things by great piety was the politically correct version, heavily edited by Cosimo and Francesco. The new ghetto was also a shrewd real estate deal, since the Medici rulers owned the property outright. They cleared an unsightly slum in the heart of their capital city. They did some basic renovation. Then they rented the premises to their new captive constituency. The ghetto that Benedetto Blanes knew consists of a small piazza with a well in the middle and one narrow street. And there were, of course, 2 gates that were locked at night, keeping Jews in and other people out. In the time of Benedetto, nearly 500 men, women, and children lived in this cramped space, occupying approximately 100 apartments and shops, all Medici property. Constitution. I have three female children, one of whom is 10 years old. The ghetto was, so there's an obligation to set things right smack in the middle of town. We can accomplish this easily with the Meanwhile, we can admire the shiny new facade of the cathedral. The Grand Duke's property administration the old center little courtyard was meticulously documented and then rented to me for 100 scudi in the usual way, the ghetto. And this then I could spread out an accident, since my only habitation is everyone was eager to forget that there had ever been such a place in the modern city of Florence, in the more or less liberal kingdom of United Italy. Including a member of the Grand Ducal family, were the most eventful slum dweller. He had 3 daughters at that time, and presumably a wife. We can count on one hand the number of surviving photographs of the old ghetto. Though by then the Jews had gone for a full generation, Grand Duke of Tuscany was, and also the main square, the so-called Piazza della Fontana. And last but not least, the vaulted passageway in the back hermetically sealed, dates from a late 17th century expansion of the ghetto. The chief synagogue, the Scuola Italiana, was on the top floor of an otherwise unremarkable Here's building. Another glimpse there of Benedetto at the top edge of the photo, in his dwelling in the Florentine ghetto. In another the only known photograph of the now vanished written on Saturday, yes, shows the Saturday ark that was built 2 April 1616, 1680s, in high Baroque style. The most illustrious excellency should not be generation after the death this letter is in an unfamiliar handwriting. On Friday afternoon, I sat down to write. This watercolor overtaken by the Sabbath to the synagogue because the day was cloudy and I did not have a clock to rely on. We are looking at an oratory constructed in Friday evening was also the beginning of Passover, by old line Florentine and was still Passover on Saturday evening, objected to the grandiose innovations of the new Moorish-style temple. I am thus unable to write with my own hand in the ultra-fashionable, but I did not feel that I could put off acknowledging your gracious letter. We see the traditional white walls and collegiate sorting out this matter. Benches facing inwards. Benedetto was toward the reader's desk and ark, more or less. The ark itself might well for operating in a 16th century original from the Italian like bringing in a Christian to write letters for him on the possibly designed by the Medici court architect Bernardo. Note the signature in the lower right-hand corner. Benedetto Blanes. How did Benedetto live his life in the close confines of the Florentine had this written? He tells us himself, or rather, he tells who were the Blanes anyway, before they landed up in single rooms as your excellency knows in the Florentine ghetto. Having visited my room, here is their family tree, showing a grand Jewish dynasty. It receives light from 2 windows that overlook a small courtyard. Down at the bottom, we have Benedetto Blanes. Up at the top, we have his great-great-grandfather, Dr. Benedetto's dwelling was probably somewhere in the highlighted area. The name Blanes, technically a legal window looking out of the ghetto into the Christian world. And Lerda presumably refers to the city. As your excellency also knows, this room is where I do my Blanes in the ghetto of Verona going back to the 1200s. The courtyard in question is very small. In 1512, only 20 years after the Spanish expulsion of 1492, and they set out tables there. This Jewish medical doctor appeared in drunken and impertinent people in the papal state, much scandalous behavior, where he was granted a banking charter by the Roman authorities. In fact, 2 friars behaved Let's run through the main line 2 of Benedetto's family tree. That has stopped my sermon. Starting at the top, Dr. Moise, also allowed filthy and shameless expressions all day, including words not uttered even in Via del Giardino. Via del Giardino, Benedetto's great-grandfather, Laudio the Elder, had a prestigious medical practice in Perugia, treating the papal governor among others. He also had a wide range of business interests and a synagogue in his own home. Dr. Laudio read the writing on the wall and moved his family from Umbria to the Medici state, 1 step ahead of the papal expulsion of 1569. In 1564, he was operating a bank in Monte San Savino in Tuscany, and by 1567, he was residing in Florence with a large household and again his own domestic synagogue. Then in 1571, the elderly doctor entered the new Florentine ghetto. This community had come into being against its will, and the Blanes were its unrivaled leaders, by default, because the other rich banking families voted with their feet and left Tuscany. Benedetto, Lauderdio's great-grandson and son of another Laudedio, alternating generations with names as was normal, was born in the ghetto around 1578, representing its first native generation. He was born there, he grew up there, he lived there. But the squeeze was on. By 1615, when Benedetto began writing his letters to Don Giovanni de Medici, he was living with his wife and daughters in a single room in a communal apartment, and he was living by his wits, trying anything and everything to stop his family's relentless decline. How did Benedetto and his kin earn their living? We know quite a lot about them and their doings, since the Blanes family is all over the Florentine police records, both sinned against and sinning. On 3 October 1619, the criminal court dealt with a typical incident of theft and thuggery in the local ghetto, involving Benedetto's younger brother, David. We are now reading from the official court finding. The Jew, David, son of Laudedio Blanes, brought this case against two men of no fixed occupation, Niccolo, son of Simone, son of Piero del Garbo, and Alessandro, son of Zanalbi, both Florentines, native Christians, that is to say. On 18 June, the two accused went to the shop belonging to the plaintiff and his father. Niccolo asked the plaintiff's mother, who was also Benedetto's mother, of course, to show him some buttons. Then he took 2 or 3 strings of them and went off without wanting to pay. The plaintiff, David Blanes, then followed the aforesaid Niccolo as far as Piazza del Palottole, telling him that this was no way to behave and that he should give back the buttons. Alessandro then took hold of the plaintiff, while Niccolo worked him over with his fists or a knife or a key, leaving him with a scratched face and a bloody nose. Then Alessandro threw a stone at him, bruising his right knee. Niccolo and Alessandro were probably surprised by the Jews' persistence, thinking they were home free once they exited the ghetto. David Blanes dogged them for several hundred feet. We can trace their path in red there. From the family shop, down the ghetto's single street, out the main gate, and then paralleling the length of the cathedral into a small square. The Blanes may have been Grand Jewish signori in Catalunya, in Umbria, and pre-Ghetto Florence. But Benedetto's daily life was scarcely aristocratic. His mother staffed the family shop, offering buttons to low-class clients, while his brother David acted as enforcer when need arose. In their ghetto emporium, the Blanes sold more than buttons to every sort of customer from the Medici themselves on down, usually with special deals and attractive discounts, in and out the back door with no questions asked. Yes, in Benedetto's Blanes' Florence, the ghetto is where you went to get it wholesale. By 5 September 1621, Benedetto was locked away in the Bargello prison, so his youngest brother, Salomon Blanes, ran the usual errands for Don Giovanni de Medici. At this time, I'm sending you some samples of taffeta, of which I can get 6 or 8 or even 10 braccia, which is as much as 6 yards. For 3 lire, 6 soldi, 8 piccioli per braccio in cash, although it costs at least 4 lire around the shops. I'm also sending you a sample of gold thread, oro filato, of which I can get 5 ounces at 5 lire, 5 soldi per ounce, more or less. Here you see taffeta and gold thread together in the same item, and a presumably Florentine embroidery from the time of Benedetto and Don Giovanni. By Florentine law, Jews were restricted to second-hand goods, especially clothing and textiles. By Florentine practice, they sold anything they could, new or used, remade or recycled, smuggled or stolen, until someone objected. When people think of Renaissance Italy, who is the first Jew that comes to mind? This is a trick question because he never existed in actual fact. Only in the fertile imagination of William Shakespeare and the boundless realm of ethnic stereotypes. If we use a small s, however, there were various Jewish Shylocks in Benedetto Blanes's Florence. The most notorious of these, in fact, was Benedetto Blanes himself. By Florentine law, usury, charging money for the use of money, was strictly forbidden. By Florentine practice, it was widely tolerated due to the scarcity of credit from legitimate sources. Benedetto Blanes to Don Giovanni De Medici, 22 November 1615. In Firenze sono 3 riscossioni. Here in Florence, I have 3 debts to realize. The Jew then lists the local aristocrats who owe him money. Giovan Francesco Albizzi, Giovan Battista Michelozzi, and Daniello Bontalenti, all families that mattered in early 17th century Florence. And Don Giovanni was with Benedetto every step of the way, pulling debtors into line and making sure that Shylock got paid. Here's a case in point, only one, I could show you hundreds. In early 17th century Florence, almost all financial cases that came before the magistrates in the police court involved Jews. Not many, not most, but almost all. I couldn't believe it either, but I spent years going through the Florentine police records. And this wasn't the sad old story of police persecution. The suits were usually initiated by the Jews themselves. Debt collection was an intensely adversarial process, and the usual method was to force a settlement by having the Christian defaulter arrested and jailed. And on rare occasions, Jews had Jewish debtors imprisoned as well. Not nice. Not kosher either, as a matter of fact. From the court records, 18 November 1615. Having seen the suit by Benedetto Blanes Ebreo against Giovan Francesco, son of Cavaliere Pandolfo degli Albizzi, for the sum of 166 scudi, as stipulated in a note of credit. Benedetto and the magistrates traced the Albizzi note of credit, or cedola as it was called, back 10 years. It was renegotiated on 5 January 1608, 29 November 1613, and 26 May 1614, accruing transaction fees along the way. Transaction fees, but not interest. Heaven forbid, that would be usury. On 15 November 1615, 3 days before the case came to court, Benedetto Blanes prepped Don Giovanni De Medici. His letter is nicely dressed up with a quote from the 20th Psalm in Hebrew. For the king hopes in the Lord, and within the kindness of the Most High he will not be shaken. Then a quick cut, finishing up with the Latin Vulgate. May your hand come upon all your enemies, and your right hand meet with all who hate you. On the left side, down towards the bottom, below the Hebrew and the Latin. La benignità e cortesia di vostra eccellenza illustrissima. Your most illustrious excellencies, graciousness and courtesy impel me to trouble you with a little task. Should you deign on my behalf to write a few lines to Signor Giovan Francesco, son of Cavaliere Pandolfo degli Albizzi. In the documentation that I am sending you, you'll see that this gentleman acknowledges his debt to me. Si riconoscesse mio debitore. I promised to wait 6 months for part of it, and 18 months for the rest. And now the time has come for him to settle the balance of approximately 170 scudi. Now we get to the good part, skipping down a few lines on the right. Per dire il vero, to tell the truth, I bought this debt from a tailor for 115 scudi in cash, though this was just between him and me. Meanwhile, I put a gold chain and a string of pearls, una catena di oro e una di perle, in the contract. So, we have an illegal, immoral, and strictly forbidden cash loan masquerading as the sale of a notional gold chain and a notional pearl necklace. There are also notional armchairs, notional tapestries, notional lengths of fabric, notional almost anything you could think of. They're going into contracts of the sort for disguised usurious loans. Benedetto's letters are full of smoking guns of this kind. Business as usual in the early 17th century. For years, Benedetto had a Medici enforcer watching his back. But what did this Christian Grand Signore get in return from a Jew in the local ghetto? Don Giovanni was an aristocratic adept of the occult. In his Florentine palace, he kept a full alchemical laboratory and a choice library of esoteric works. In the lower right, you see not Don Giovanni De Medici, but his half-brother, Grand Duke Francesco I, and immediately above him, an alchemical treatise of the time. Benedetto Blanes was Don Giovanni's librarian, cataloging and organizing his library, and seeking out rare volumes, usually on the Inquisition's Index of Forbidden Books. Benedetto was also Don Giovanni's aspiring master of the arcane, trading on the dangerous glamour of the Jewish other, and more concretely on his personal and family associations. In the time of Benedetto Blanes and Don Giovanni de' Medici, the Jews were loathed and feared, but also admired and envied, as an uncanny people with rare supernatural powers. On the left, you see a 16th century German woodcut, casting the domestic ritual of Havdalah at the close of the Sabbath as a veritable black mass. The Jewish adept raises a chalice and studies his fingernails, looking into the future, while acolytes with candle and spice box stand ready on a would-be altar. For any art historians that are here, you'll recognize this immediately as a takeoff on the miraculous Mass of St. Gregory, a standard iconographic formula. On the right, we have a popular Jewish redaction, popular Latin redaction of Joseph G. Cattilla's Shara Ora Portae Lucis, Gate of Light. This is the Gate of Light, which is the portal of the Tetragrammaton, referring to the 4 letters that comprise the miracle-working name of God. The Jewish magus grasps a tree of the Sephirot, explicating the 10 emanations of divine presence that structure most Kabbalistic practices. In the summer of 1615, Don Giovanni de' Medici moved from Florence to Venice as the supreme commander of the Venetian army. Benedetto's subsequent letters read like an incessant sales pitch as he strove to keep his Medici connection alive. Your Excellency gives me good reason to hope that I will once again enjoy your noble and divine presence in the divinity of those studies, particularly since I'm expecting that tree, quell'albero, from that Jew in Lippiano. Benedetto is referring to a more elaborate version of the tree of the Sephiroth that we see here. That tree, quell'albero, comes by way of an uncle of mine who is a doctor, so it'll be easy to have it drawn and copied if Your Excellency wishes. And then there were books, especially curious ones, by astrologers, alchemists, and Kabbalists of every sort. I should tell you that I happened to come across a volume of works by Paracelsus, including his most curious writings, that is to say, books 9, 10, and 11, discussing his occult philosophy, Occulta Philosophia. I could tell from the title that we were dealing with a curious book, Libro Curioso, and I know how jealous Your Excellency is when it comes to things of this kind. Indeed, you're quite right to be jealous, since they are sometimes not to be had at any price. Like most great patrons, Don Giovanni was a busy man with many people fighting for his attention. So Benedetto was infinitely ingenious in promoting his latest discoveries of curious books and no less curious devotees of the occult. One of the most remarkable was Dr. Samuel Kajesi, or Hajes, a Jewish merchant of Moroccan origin, commonly known as Dr. Samuel from Fez. The Dr. Samuel story runs for many months in Benedetto's letters to Don Giovanni, declining rapidly from cosmic drama to outrageous farce. The Moroccan magus proposed an elaborate exercise in divination, summoning a familiar spirit from the world beyond. The friend that he is seeking to acquire is named Lecomar. Benedetto underlines the name Lecomar in his letter. Since that friend is solar and the celestial lights were put in place on the fourth day of creation, we should wait until Wednesday. The first apparition needs to take place on that day. The place of invocation was a small body of stagnant water, cryptically referred to as the peschiera or fish pond. And the play on the days of creation seems a direct borrowing from classic Kabbalah. He instructed me to go there at that time and enclose those 5 canes with a red thread, un filo rosso. I must begin with one of the outer canes and go to the one in the middle, then from the one in the middle to the second, then from the second to the third, and so on. More or less as you see here in my notably low-tech scrawl. Benedetto then had to burn various herbs and spices and recite a long incantation in Arabic, not Hebrew, in Arabic. So much for cosmic drama. What about outrageous farce? Dr. Samuel was simply making it up as he went along, and he knew perfectly well that he could not pull off the Lecomar stunt. So he took to his bed with a strategic attack of gout, forcing Benedetto to do the work and assume the responsibility. Then finally, Dr. Samuel skipped town. Peggy, this is probably a cousin or nephew of the much better known Samuel Hajes. I mean, it's there's some questions about the various ramifications of that family. Okay. This, above all, is the story that I tell in my book. Oops. Okay, we're caught up. Benedetto Blanes lived his life on the edge. His letters chronicle a breathtaking cycle of close calls, comic misadventures, and daring escapes for 6 intense years until his luck ran out. This, above all, is a story that I tell in my book. Like most Jews, Benedetto did anything he could to earn a living, making a place for himself in a generally hostile world. Like many, he developed a taste, a compulsion, even an addiction to danger. running risks for their own sake, for the sheer love of the sport. In Florence, the Holy Office of the Inquisition had its headquarters in the Franciscan monastery of Santa Croce, a notorious center of anti-Jewish activity. In Benedetto's letters, we see him playing hide and seek with banned books, astrology, alchemy, and Kabbalah, right under the Inquisitor's nose. Benedetto narrates his terrifying encounters with Monsignor Cornelio Pietoni, the local Father Inquisitor, for example, in the spring of 1619. I presented myself in the company of our governors, the Jewish governors of the Ghetto, and the Inquisitor was not merely stern, he was downright furious. He had no choice, he announced, but to imprison me. The Inquisitor stated with great severity, right to my face, that I was a bad Jew, mal ebreo, which offended me deeply. He did not know me, I told him, so how could he claim a profound understanding of my character? Some people were obviously not telling him the truth. Even worse, they probably were. Finally, we took our leave with little satisfaction on my part, since he ordered me to return on Monday. The Father Inquisitor, I deduced, had something else in his stomach, not just that book. On Monday, the Father Inquisitor cited chapter and verse on why Benedetto was a bad Jew. Io ero un mal ebreo perché entrare da un stato in un altro si intendeva essere un mal ebreo, a non stare nel suo ebraismo. I was a bad Jew, he said, because I went from one condition to another and did not stay Jewish. That, he said, was his definition of a bad Jew. Was Benedetto a bad Jew? He was certainly an ingenious one, probably too smart for his own good, operating in a strange no-man's land between the Florentine Ghetto and the Medici court. And he had many enemies, some in very high places. This fiercely underlined letter, also to Don Giovanni De Medici, is from Raphael Gualterotti, the leading astrologer at the Medici court, eclipsing even Galileo Galilei in his power and influence at that time. He did not welcome Benedetto's competition in the occult, to put it mildly, and he tells us what else was upsetting the Father Inquisitor's stomach. I imagine that you were put on guard by my discussion of alchemy, and this presumably reflects the judgment of Benedetto Brandes, a vaguely Portuguese form of Blanes. Then Gualterotti is off and running. I never gave him the least credence, since I know to whom he was born and under which stars. Now he is thundering because I converted a half-brother-in-law of his to the true faith. Actually, the North African husband of Benedetto's second cousin. But this makes me laugh, since I know him for the knave that he is, a traitor and a sorcerer, no Jew at all, but an infamous idolater. In any case, Benedetto's relative is going to be baptized, whether Benedetto likes it or not, because this relative is now staying in my own house. Gualterotti's denunciation is weird and obsessive, but more or less true. An isolation cell in the Bargello prison, an isolation cell in the Bargello prison circa 1900. Little had changed since Benedetto's long stay. He was arrested in June of 1620 and remained more or less here until we really don't know when. He faced various charges by both the Florentine police and the Roman Inquisition: illegal usury, trafficking in banned books, and gravest of all, abducting Jewish children in order to prevent their conversion to Catholicism. This is the last surviving letter. I'll need about 3 or 4 more minutes. This is the last surviving letter from Benedetto Blanes to Don Giovanni De Medici, smuggled out of the Bargello prison on 26 September 1620. It measures less than 3 by 4 inches. It's about this size. It's tiny. It was rolled up and smuggled out of the prison. covered with 21 lines of tiny, barely legible writing. I've been working in the Medici Grand Ducal Archive for over 30 years. I've discovered many compelling documents. Few have hit me quite so hard with this impact of human immediacy. Illustrissimo et eccellentissimo mio signore e patrone singularissimo, my most illustrious and excellent lord and unique patron. In these present miseries, I'm kept alive by my own innocence and by the hope of your most illustrious excellency's protection. I bear these misfortunes willingly, trusting that I'll be restored to glory at long last in the company of all the innocent, while those who speak evil will be destroyed. These hopes will be realized more quickly and easily with your intervention. If you defend me with greater vigor from the pestilent tongues of those who defame and slander me. If the tribunal calls on me to account for the time that I spent in your excellency's company, reading, writing, and virtuously studying holy scriptures, you might do well to bring that most precious book, the Mirror of Truth, O Specchio della Verità, which publicly demonstrates the veracity of all I say. In those printed pages of scholarly doctrine full of Hebraic, Greek, and Latin writings, you'll see how you and I passed our time. I can do nothing more in these present conditions, and you already know my needs better than I can describe them. So I entrust my family to you, hoping that you will resolve the calamitous misfortune that afflicts it. May God bring you every happiness. Pasqua, Benedetto Blanes. Unfortunately for Benedetto, Don Giovanni was no longer in a position to protect anyone from anything. He was already on his deathbed. It was a long, slow death from generalized infections after many years of hard living. He was out on the outs with his employers, the Venetian government. He was on the outs with his own family, the Medici in Florence. He was also flat broke. What about the Specchio della Verità, the Mirror of Truth? Those printed pages of scholarly doctrine full of Hebraic, Greek, and Latin writings. Together, Benedetto and Don Giovanni had been producing an ambitious occult treatise. Then, after Don Giovanni's death on 19 July 1621, Medici agents in Venice seized the engraved plates and sent them to Florence. Needless to say, they were never seen again. Finally, there's the mysterious word Pasqua, an evident afterthought, squeezed into the lower right-hand corner of this tiny note. Pasqua normally refers to either the Christian Easter or the Jewish Passover. But this was late September, and those two holidays did not occur for another 6 months, until April of 1621. In this case, Pasqua evidently served as an emergency code, an age-old shibboleth invoking Jewish deliverance from captivity and other evils. Pesach, Pasqua, Passover. Don Giovanni would have known this well from his excursions into the Jewish and the quasi-Jewish occult. Last slide. I would love to take you step by step through the rise and fall of Benedetto Blanes, as narrated in his own letters and thousands of other documents in the Medici Grand Ducal Archive. But this is like a nonstop car chase, and I've already spoken for far too long. I'm now looking forward to your questions and comments. We've only begun to unlock the secrets of Benedetto Blanes and his world. Thank you.
Thank you so much. That was really fascinating. Book sale is back there, but if you have one or two questions, we'll be happy to see if Edward can answer them for you. Yes.
My question is about Don Giovanni's non-response, that there are 200 letters to him and one from him. Does Edward think that they were lost or misplaced, or that he was not responding, or
Okay, so,
protecting himself, not putting things in
okay,
writing?
why was there just one letter from Don Giovanni and 200 from Benedetto Blanes?
Okay, I'll give you the very short version. That's a very good question, by the way.
Let's speak into the microphone.
So it'll be a better answer if I speak into the microphone. Okay. Benedetto wrote letters to Don Giovanni on basically a weekly basis. The series begins when Don Giovanni moved from Florence to Venice. So in order to keep the connection going, Benedetto had to put all this incredibly incriminating stuff in writing. No sane person would have put it in writing. I often can't believe it when I read this stuff. These things were sent to him, to Don Giovanni in Venice. Don Giovanni was a public figure, and he had the household of a public figure. He had secretaries and so forth, who took charge of his correspondence. The letters were saved, along with his other letters, in a folder of their own, the Benedetto Buono's folder. And meanwhile, Don Giovanni's letters, in the other direction, went into some guy's, on some guy's writing table in a ghetto apartment. Benedetto's home was ransacked several times and his papers seized. And almost anything from him, anything that he received has simply gone up in the air. But after Don Giovanni's death, they sent people from Florence to go to Venice and get rid of anything that looked suspicious, that could shed light that better not shed on a member of the family. Masses of Kabbalistic, necromantic, sorcerer, enough material to stock a sorcerer's warehouse was seized and sent to Florence, and it disappeared. Books and papers were seized and disappeared. But evidently, these were just overlooked and just stayed in his archive with the other correspondence of his. So they're sitting there in the Medici Granducal Archive. There is one letter from Don Giovanni to Benedetto. It was sent with the other mail from Don Giovanni. The Medici had their own mail service between Florence and Venice. It went basically in the diplomatic pouch, as it were, in a separate folder, all the stuff that Don Giovanni was sending, and was then distributed in Florence by the members of his own household in Florence. And I actually have a letter from the maggiordomo, basically, the man who ran Don Giovanni's household, saying about the one letter that survived, I couldn't deliver this to Benedetto Buono's Hebreo because he is in segreta, which means incommunicado, an isolation cell in prison. So it was sent back to Venice. Yeah.
Yes, sir.
To understand my question, I have to say my name. My name is Giacomo Nunes.
Okay.
I understand what it means. And also I have cousin whose name is Calo. So from my family, direct family, I am from Livorno, Lake Home,
Sure.
and from all the members of the family, they are from the Ghetto of Florence.
Okay.
So maybe you are the only person who can answer me one major question.
Okay.
Why in Lebanon were free, not in a ghetto, free to come back to Judaism, free to settle anywhere, and why in Florence were put in a ghetto, obliged to stay there during the night, closed, and maintain in this kind of lower situation than in Lagos?
Okay. Thank you very much for coming. And you'll find a Nunes in the index of my book, by the way. He was involved in, actually, quite a grand Portuguese merchant of Portuguese origin who was in and out of Florence with Diego Teixeira, the famous Diego Teixeira. And I actually know the members of the Calò family in Florence. In fact, I bought shirts from them. They're the owners of Vesky, the Grand Haberdasher. Vesky is the name they had until they closed last year. It was the name of the Aryan controller from the 1930s. It's actually Hermano Calò. Okay, You have asked me 30 extremely complicated questions. I will try to give you one very simple answer. Deep breath. Okay. One of the extraordinary phenomenon is the Jewish ghetto in Florence. There was also a ghetto in Siena. And then there were the privileged coastal cities of Pisa and Livorno. There were the famous Livornine, the edicts of 1591 and 93, that stated that the Jews, any Jews who had money, and were probably going to be Nunez and Casuto and Teixeira and people like this, from the Portuguese, Iberian side, who wanted to settle, could trade freely and live wherever they wished, and so forth. This was an extraordinarily important grant of rights. It was self-interest, like all grants to Jews. We cannot talk about when did people like Jews and when did they not? They never liked Jews, but sometimes it paid to grant privileges. The Grand Dukes had this great hope that Jews would come in with commercial connections, money, startup industries, get the new carrying trade in this brand new port city Livorno going. However, trying to stick to a shortage has already gotten too long. The Livornine, these grants of privileges, are not what they seem. In fact, a lot of work has been done in the last few years, and I actually have a whole chapter that talks about this. There are lots of grants of special privileged individuals. When you deal with an autocratic state like the Medici Grand Duke of Tuscany, laws are besides the point. It's grace and favor from the prince. There were there were the Mendes, there were all these different families before 1590 who were given pretty much the same privileges as the Livornine. Then there were the fine print of the Livornine. Anyone who came to Livorno or Pisa and register with the consuls of the Consuli del Mare could then enjoy those privileges anywhere in the Grand Dukedom. So you actually had a fair number of people registered in Pisa and Livorno who were living in Florence with special privileges. But every 10 minutes, the laws would change. People would still keep running as if the Livornini didn't exist and run to the Grand Duke and say, can I please live outside the ghetto? Can I do this, that, and the other? So the Livornini were extremely important. They also kind of disappear when you don't see them. The really important difference is that Jews with money settled in Livorno and Pisa and ran in and out of Florence. So so the Jews in Florence tended to be, by definition, underclass. By 1596, you already had a separate Levantine synagogue, a school in Levantina that was found in the ghetto, for the convenience of the Nunezes and the Mendeses and the Casutos who were running from Livorno to Pisa to do business in Florence. Meanwhile, the Jews only had a really good 20 years under the Livornini until about 1620. Then they started trying to strip rights away, or at least make it so the individual had to ask for the rights. Anyone in a princely state can do anything he wants as long as the prince says it's okay. And the Medici then tried to take closer control. But anyway, listen, I'd be delighted to talk to you some more about this individually. I've got a lot to say about this.
Okay, thank you. One last quick question. Ann Lynn.
I wanted to ask about the state of preservation of these documents, because you're saying that they were in some sort of portfolio, but now they're bound. Are they silked? And when would they be bound and silked?
Okay, the state of preservation
Okay.
of these documents.
Okay. The state of preservation, cutting to the chase, is generally good considering. Originally, these letters had been, for a very long time, bound in quires, numbered rather out of order. The sheets were numbered as bound in quires, so it really was not, they were not in chronological order. In the early 70s, they were taken apart. Most of them were fairly good condition, but they were all stabilized, deacidified. A few of them that were in somewhat dubious condition became a bit difficult to read because there was so much silicose that went onto them. But they were taken out and mounted on hinges on separate supports, Sorry, cellulose is what I meant, sorry. Sorry about that. I actually can, I'll give you my card with my email address. Contact me, and I can give you the full preservation. I also have a transcription of the conservator's form that went into the volumes. And they were divided into 2 volumes. Okay?
Thank you very much. Thank you all for coming. The books are in the back, and I have order forms in the front.
This has been a presentation of the Library of Congress. Visit us at loc.gov.